There are some things we're not meant to understand. Nature holds secrets darker than our minds can handle, ancient things that should stay buried in ice and shadow. I learned this the hard way during the winter of '62, up on Mount Baker. The official records were classified, marked as an avalanche incident. But I know what really happened. The nightmares won't let me forget. I'm William Foster, Bill to most folks. Been a ranger in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest for 15 years, specializing in winter rescue operations. Ex-military, trained mountaineer, the guy they called when things got bad up high. After losing my climbing team to an avalanche in '60, I threw myself into the work even harder. Figured, if I could save enough people, maybe it would balance out those I couldn't. But nothing in my training could have prepared me for that winter. It started with the snow. Record snowfall that year, the kind that makes the old-timers nervous. By December, we had over 15 feet at the ranger station, with more coming down every day. The drifts crawled up the windows like pale fingers, and the wind. Christ, the wind. It howled through the pines like something alive, something hungry. I was stationed at the high camp, 6,000 feet up, just me and Derek Johnson, my junior ranger. Good kid, eager to learn. Too eager, maybe. The storms had knocked out our radio more times than I could count, leaving us isolated for days at a stretch. But we had supplies, experience, and protocols. Should have been routine. The first sign something was wrong came in late October. A group of hikers went missing on the northwest face, experienced folks who knew the mountain. Search turned up nothing. Not unusual this time of year, though it still ate at me. But then November brought 3 more disappearances. December, 5. All in the same general area, all without a trace. Something's not right, Bill, Derek said one morning, staring out at the endless white. The locals are spooked. Heard some of the tribal elders talking about something called the ice walk. I brushed it off initially. 15 years on the mountain, you hear all kinds of stories. But then we found the track. 3-toed impressions in the deep snow. Massive things, like nothing I'd seen before. And the ice formations. Jesus, the ice formation. We found the first one at about 7,000 feet. A towering spire of crystal clear ice. Maybe 12 feet high. Not unusual in itself, but inside. Inside was blood, frozen in perfect crimson ribbons, suspended like some kind of twisted art piece. Derek threw up when we found it. I nearly did too. The wildlife started turning up next. Dead animals, deer, mountain goats, even a bear, arranged in precise geometric patterns. Like some sick ritual, their bodies were frozen solid, covered in a layer of ice so clear you could see their terrified expressions underneath. The cold had somehow penetrated their flesh, crystalline structures forming inside their tissue. The Park Service lab couldn't explain it. Nobody could. That's when the dreams started. Every night, the same thing. I'm walking through a blizzard, following something massive and pale. It moves like smoke through the snow, always just ahead, always just out of sight. And the cold. Not normal cold, but something that seems to reach inside you, trying to freeze your very thought. I started digging through old records, talking to local tribes. The stories went back generations. Tales of something ancient sleeping in the glacier, something that walked before man, that froze in the ice ages ago. And now, with the climate slowly warming, maybe it was waking up. Derek thought I was losing it. Can't blame him, I was starting to think the same thing. But then came the night that changed everything. January 15th, 1962. I'll never forget that day. The storm that night was biblical. Wind gusts over 80 miles per hour. Temperature dropping to -40. Derek was trying to reach anyone on the radio, while I checked our supplies for the 100th time. That's when we heard it. A sound like cracking ice, but deeper, almost like sing. The power went first, plunging us into darkness. Our backup generator kicked in, but the emergency lights only made the shadows worse, turning every corner into a potential hiding place. The windows were completely buried in snow, and the wind had changed. It wasn't howling anymore, it was whispering. Derek saw it first. He was by the radio when he suddenly went rigid, staring out the window. "Bill," he whispered, There's something out there. I moved to look, but he grabbed my arm. His hand was ice cold. It looks like ice, but it's moving, like it's breathing. Before I could respond, the window exploded inward. The thing that came through, I still struggled to describe. It was like the ice itself had come alive, formed into something vaguely humanoid, but wrong in every possible way. Crystalline structures that shifted and flowed like water, but frozen in impossible geometry. Where its face should have been, there was only a complex pattern of ice crystals, reflecting our terror back at us. Derek tried to run. God, I wish he hadn't run. The creature moved like lightning, crossing the room in a heartbeat. One touch, that's all it took. I watched as the ice spread from its hand, crawling across Derek's skin like frost on a window. He didn't even have time to scream before he was completely frozen, his face locked in an expression of pure horror. I grabbed my rifle, but it was useless. The bullets froze in mid-air, dropping to the floor like hail. The creature advanced, the temperature plummeting with each step. My breath came out in clouds of crystals, and I could feel the cold trying to work its way inside me, trying to freeze my blood in my veins. That's when I remembered the geothermal vents, the mountain's heat bubbling up from below, and the dynamite we kept for avalanche control. What happened next is mostly a blur. I remember running, the thing pursuing me through the blizzard. Remember the wind cutting like knives, the snow so thick I could barely see. Every few steps I'd catch glimpses of it, sometimes as a pillar of ice, sometimes as something so alien it hurt to look at. I made it to the vent, a crack in the rock that leaked steam even in the coldest weather. The creature followed, its crystalline form distorting in the heat. I waited until it was close, threw the dynamite, and ran like hell. The explosion echoed across the mountain. When I looked back, the creature was gone, shattered into thousands of glittering pieces. But as I watched, the fragments began to melt, seeping into the rock, down into the deep cracks that led to the mountain's heart. Sometimes, in my worst moments, I wonder if that's what it wanted all along, to go deeper, to sleep again, until the world grows warmer still. They found me 2 days later, half frozen but alive. My hair had turned completely white, and the doctors couldn't explain the crystalline patterns they found in my frostbitten tissue. The official report blamed an avalanche for Derek's death and the destruction at the station. Said the cold and isolation had made me delirious, that I'd imagined everything else. But I know what I saw, and I know it's still there, deep in the mountain, waiting. The ice on Baker holds secrets, ancient, patient things that sleep in the cold dark. And sometimes, on winter nights when the wind whispers through the pines, I swear I can hear it singing. They say the glacier is melting faster now, retreating a little more each year. And sometimes, when I look at recent satellite photos of the mountain, I think I see patterns in the ice, geometric shapes that shouldn't be there, growing larger with each passing season. I don't go up on Baker anymore. Can't stand the cold. But I watch the weather reports, especially in winter, and when they predict record snowfall, I make sure I'm somewhere warm, somewhere far from the mountain and its secret. Because the thing about ice is, it remembers, and what sleeps in Baker's heart is slowly waking up. I've worked in wilderness areas for 15 years, and I know the difference between animal sounds and human screams. What I heard that night in the Boundary Waters wasn't either. It was something ancient, something that shouldn't exist, and now that I've heard it, I can't unhear it. I can't unsee what I saw, and I can't forget the faces in the trees. My name is Maria Delgado. Until 6 months ago, I was a search and rescue specialist in Arizona's Sonoran Desert. The transfer to northern Minnesota was supposed to be a fresh start after my divorce. A chance to trade scorching heat for cool forests, jagged cacti for towering pines. The locals warned me that the Boundary Waters had their own dangers, but I brushed them off. I'd handled mountain lions, flash floods, and lost hikers in 100-degree heat. How bad could a few trees be? The first warning signs started 3 weeks after I arrived. My partner Thomas and I were marking trails When we found a hunter's backpack hanging from a branch 15 feet up, not caught on the branch, hanging neatly by its straps, as if someone had placed it there. The contents were scattered across the forest floor. Compass, matches, granola bars, all spread out in a perfect circle. Thomas, a 20-year veteran of these woods, went pale. "Someone's messing with us," I said, taking photos for the incident report. "Probably kids." Thomas shook his head. "Kids don't come out this far, and look at the bark." I followed his gaze to the tree trunk. Carved into it was a symbol I'd never seen before, curved lines forming what looked like an eye, with strange markings radiating outward. The cuts were fresh, oozing sap. "It's gang signs or something," I insisted. But even as I said it, I noticed how quiet the forest had become. No bird song, no squirrels chattering. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles that somehow sounded like breathing. Over the next few weeks, we found more backpacks, more symbols. The trees themselves started to look wrong. Trunks twisted into impossible shapes, branches bent at unnatural angles. I'd mark a trail one day and return the next to find the markers moved, leading deeper into the forest. Thomas grew increasingly agitated, muttering about the walker and refusing to patrol after sunset. I finally cornered him in the ranger station and demanded answers. He poured us both coffee with trembling hands and told me about the disappearances. 2 hikers in 1962, a family of 4 in 1975, a geology student just last year, all in the same area, all without a trace. Local Ojibwe elders spoke of an ancient guardian that protected sacred burial grounds from intruders, a being that was neither plant nor animal but something in between. They called it the Forest Walker. "That's just stories," I said. "Urban legends to keep people from disturbing burial sites." Thomas stared into his coffee, then explained the Larson family. 2 days later, we got the call. The Larsons' parents and 2 teenage kids hadn't returned from their camping trip. Their car was still at the trailhead, tent and supplies untouched at their campsite. But the family was gone, leaving only footprints that led to the base of a massive white pine and simply stopped. The search lasted 3 days. We found more symbols, more twisted trees, and scraps of the Larsons' clothing scattered like breadcrumbs. Each piece led us deeper into the forest, until even I had to admit we were following a trail that something wanted us to follow. On the 3rd night, we heard the whistling, a high, hollow sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. Thomas grabbed my arm, his face ashen. "We have to go, now." We turned back, but nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed to have moved, creating new paths that all led to the same place, a grove of ancient pines arranged in a perfect circle. As we approached, I saw more symbols carved into each trunk, glowing faintly in the darkness. And in the center of the circle stood something that still haunts my nightmares. It was tall, at least 12 feet, with a body like bark and limbs like branches. Where its face should have been, there was only an impression of features, like a crude carving come to life. It swayed slightly, movements fluid yet wrong, like a tree bending in a wind that wasn't there. Thomas screamed. I reached for him, but he was already running straight toward the creature. I watched in horror as he slammed into its chest and simply disappeared. The creature's bark-like skin rippled, and for a moment I saw Thomas's face pressed against it from the inside, mouth open in a silent scream. I ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, I realized I could see the ranger station's lights through the trees. I'd somehow covered miles in what felt like minutes. The official search for Thomas lasted 2 weeks. They found nothing, of course. The Forest Service brought in helicopters, and one crashed mysteriously, the pilot babbling about trees that moved in a shape that walked between them. Finally, an Ojibwe elder named Joseph came to the station. He listened to my story without surprise and nodded slowly. "The walker guards the old places," he said. "It takes those who don't respect them, keeps them, changes them. The trees remember, you see. They remember everything. I thought he was speaking metaphorically until we found the surveillance footage. A motion-activated camera had caught something moving through the forest at night. The video showed trees shifting position when no one was looking, creating new paths, herding unwary hikers toward that terrible grove. And sometimes, in the darkness between frames, there was a suggestion of something tall and thin walking between the trunks, its movements too fluid for anything made of wood. The next day, I went back one last time, armed with sacred tobacco Joseph had given me. I found the grove again, or it found me, and scattered the tobacco around its perimeter. As I worked, I saw them, faces in the bark of every tree, perfectly preserved like insects in amber. Men, women, children from every decade, stretching back before cameras could have recorded them. And Thomas, his features already taking on the texture of wood grain. The Forest Service declared the area off-limits, citing environmental concerns. We put up warning signs and no trespassing markers, but they keep disappearing, replaced by those strange eye symbols carved into the trees. Sometimes at night, I still hear the whistling, and when the wind blows from that direction, I swear I can hear voices in it. Thomas's voice among them, calling people deeper into the pines. I requested a transfer back to Arizona the next day. Give me scorpions and rattlesnakes over whatever walks those woods. At least desert creatures kill you cleanly, and your body stays your own. But I still dream about the boundary waters, about the faces in the trees. And sometimes, when I look at photos from my time there, I notice the trees in the background aren't quite in the same positions they were when I took the pictures. If you're planning a trip to northern Minnesota, stick to the marked trails. Don't go into the deep woods, especially near the old burial grounds. And if you hear whistling on the wind, or notice the trees don't look quite the way they did a moment ago, run. Run as fast as you can, and don't look back. Because the pines have eyes, and the forest walker is always hungry for new faces to add to its collection. I've been putting off writing this account for nearly 40 years now. Maybe it's because I'm getting older, or maybe it's the recent disappearances in Devil's Canyon that finally pushed me to share what happened back in '86. Either way, the nightmares haven't stopped, and I figure someone needs to know the truth before I take it to my grave. My name is Jack Thompson. I served as a park ranger in the Devil's Canyon system from 1972 to 1986. Being Navajo on my mother's side helped me land the job. The Park Service was trying to improve relations with local tribes back then, but my heritage ended up meaning a whole lot more than just checking a diversity box on some government form. The summer of '86 was brutal, even by Arizona standards. The drought had stretched into its third year, and the canyon walls were shedding rock like dead skin. Wildlife was scarce, pushing down into the deeper reaches where the last traces of water still lingered. The tourists had mostly stopped coming, scared off by the heat and the growing number of accident signs we'd had to post at the trailhead. That should have been my first warning. Nature abhors a vacuum, and something else was moving into those empty spaces we'd left behind. It started with the cattle. Rogers, who ran the closest ranch to the canyon rim, lost 3 head in the first week of June. Nothing unusual about that. Mountain lions get desperate in drought time. But when I hiked out to examine the kills, something felt wrong. 25 years of tracking lions through these canyons had taught me their habit. Lions are efficient killers, taking what they need and moving on. These carcasses looked more like ritual sacrifices, splayed open and arranged in ways that made my skin crawl. I radioed Mike Running Bear about it. Mike was our resident archaeologist, studying the ancient cliff dwellings scattered throughout the canyon system. He'd been documenting some unusual petroglyphs lately, fresh ones, appearing overnight on rock faces that had been blank for centuries. "Something stirring out there, Jack," he told me, voice crackling over the radio. "The elders warned me about it last month. Said the drought's waking up things that should stay sleeping." I should have listened harder to those warnings. Should have remembered the stories my grandmother used to tell about the dark things that lived in these canyons long before our people came. But 40 years of government service had painted a rational veneer over those old beliefs. I wrote up my report, citing mountain lion activity and recommending increased patrol. That night I saw the lights for the first time. I was doing a late check of the rim trail when I spotted them. Pale blue orbs dancing in the canyon depths, like St. Elmo's fire gone wrong. They moved with purpose, weaving between the rock spires in formation. I radioed dispatch, but by the time I described what I was seeing, they had vanished. The next morning, another section of the rim trail had collapsed. Third one that month. The rockfall pattern was wrong. The debris looked pushed from below rather than naturally eroded. While examining the site, I found something that made my blood run cold. Handprints pressed into the solid rock face, as if someone or something had climbed up through stone itself. Mike was excited when I showed him the prints. "Look at the whorl pattern," he said, tracing them with a trembling finger. "They match ones I found in the lower Kiva chambers, the really old ones, from before the ancestral Pueblo." He showed me his latest photos, crude figures drawn in red ochre, depicting a tall, emaciated being with too many joints. The same figure appeared in multiple sites, always accompanied by smaller shapes that I realized were meant to be human bodies, splayed and broken like Roger's cat. "The elders call it Yi Nao Lushi," Mike whispered. "Skinwalker, but not like the usual ones. Something older, something that was here when the first people came down into the canyon." I wanted to dismiss it as archaeological speculation, but that night, the screaming started. It came from the direction of Roger's ranch, a high, inhuman wail that set every dog for miles howling in response. By the time I got there, the whole family was dead. The body. I've seen mountain lion attacks, bear maulings, every kind of violent death the desert can dish out. This was different. They'd been arranged, posed like the petroglyphs in Mike's photo. And on the wall, drawn in something darker than ochre, was that same tall, twisted figure. The official report blamed it on a psychotic drifter. We both knew better. Something was marking its territory, reclaiming what it considered its own. The next week, 3 hikers went missing from the North Ridge Trail. We found their gear scattered across half a mile, but no bodies. Then Mike disappeared. I was the one who found what was left of him. Down in the lower Kiva he'd been excavating. He'd been skinned with surgical precision, his empty face frozen in a look of recognition. Worse than the body was what I found nearby. Mike himself, apparently alive and well, emerging from another chamber. "Jack? Thank God you're here," it said with Mike's voice, wearing Mike's face. "I've found something incredible. You need to see this." I ran. Somehow made it back to my truck before the thing wearing my friend's skin could catch me. But I couldn't outrun the truth anymore. The old stories were real, and I was dealing with something far beyond my authority as a park ranger. I went to the reservation elders. They'd been expecting me. The ceremony took 3 days. Prayers, sacred herbs, blessed weapons passed down through generations. They marked me with protective symbols and warned me that confronting the skinwalker might cost more than just my life. "It feeds on more than flesh," the medicine man told me. "It takes memories, knowledge, everything that makes a person who they are. Kill it if you can, but do not let it take your skin. Better to die whole than live as an empty shell." I won't describe everything that happened in that final confrontation. The official report lists 3 rangers killed in action, cause of death redacted. The truth is worse. I saw what a human body can become when something else wears it like a suit. I learned how a person's screams change when they're watching their own skin walk away without them. The blessed weapons hurt it. I know that much. When the obsidian blade pierced its stolen flesh, it screamed with voices I recognized. Mike, the Rogers family, countless others. Black blood hissed and smoked where it hit the Kiva floor, but I couldn't finish it. Maybe because some part of me still saw Mike's face, even as it twisted and split into something ancient and horrible. Maybe because, deep down, I knew this was its place, its home long before humans dared to carve dwellings into these cliffs. I put in for early retirement the next day, left Arizona entirely. But I still check the news feeds, scanning for familiar patterns. 3 weeks ago, I saw the report, 2 climbers missing in Devil's Canyon. Bodies found arranged in familiar poses, fresh petroglyphs appearing overnight. It's still there, waiting in the deep canyon shadows, wearing faces it stole 40 years ago, adding new ones to its collection. The drought is back this year, bad as 86. The canyon is emptying again. Sometimes, on cold nights, I swear I can feel it watching me through borrowed eyes, waiting to add my skin to its wardrobe. And sometimes, in my darkest dreams, I see Mike's face split into that ancient grin. And I wonder, did I ever really make it out of that key? Or am I just another story it's wearing? Another voice in its chorus of stolen soul? If you're reading this, stay away from Devil's Canyon. But if you must go, watch the shadows carefully. And if you meet someone you know out there, someone who smiles too wide and speaks of incredible discoveries, run. Run as fast and far as you can. Just don't expect to outrun the questions that will haunt you for the rest of your days. What really lives in those ancient cliffs? How many skins has it worn? And how can you be sure that the face you see in the mirror is still your own? The sequoias have stood sentinel for thousands of years, their bark thickened by countless fires, their heights reaching impossibly toward heaven. But in all my years as a ranger in California's northern forests, I never imagined they could hide secrets quite like this. Even now, decades later, my hands shake as I put these words to paper. Some nights I still wake in cold sweats, thinking I hear that soft scratching sound above my bedroom ceiling. I suppose I should start at the beginning. It was 1955, and I'd been working the Redwood Grove district for nearly 7 years. The transition from smoke jumping during the war to forest ranger had seemed natural enough. Both jobs required a clear head in crisis and comfort with isolation. Most folks assumed my occasional 1,000-yard stares came from the war. Truth is, by 55, I'd mostly made peace with those old ghosts. The new ones, though, well, they're another matter entirely. That spring brought record rainfall, the kind that turns dirt roads into mud rivers and sets whole hillsides sliding. We lost 3 access routes in the first month alone. The locals called it biblical, but I just called it a headache. Every day brought new reports of collapsed trails and trees down across fire breaks. But the rain also drew something else out of those ancient woods. Something that should have stayed buried. The first sign came in early April. I was checking washed-out sections along the eastern ridge when I found it. A Douglas fir absolutely dripping with sap. Now, some resin flow is normal, but this was different. The amber liquid was thick as honey and had a sickly sweet smell that turned my stomach. Stranger still were the patterns it made. Perfect vertical lines, like someone had scored the bark with surgical precision. I radioed it in to Dave Erickson, my partner at the station. He suggested bark beetles, but I'd never seen beetle damage create such uniform patterns. That same week, we got word about the Stevenson couple. Experienced hikers, they'd set out for a 3-day trek along the old growth trail. When they didn't check in, I led the search party myself. We found their camp on day 2, tent still pitched, sleeping bags laid out, camp stove ready with coffee grounds for the morning. Their boots were there, their maps, everything except the Stevensons themselves. The only oddity was a thick splash of that same amber sap across their tent's entrance. I'd seen enough missing persons cases to know people don't just vanish without a trace. They leave signs, broken branches, discarded items, footprints. The Stevensons left nothing. It was as if they'd simply ceased to exist. The nights started getting strange after that. I'd catch glimpses of lights between the trees during my patrols. Not flashlights, more like the bioluminescent glow of fungus, but moving, always just at the edge of vision. The locals had stories, of course. They talked about spirit lights and tree walkers, old legends from the tribes that once lived here. I'd always dismissed such tales as campfire stories meant to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods, but those lights, they had a way of making you question things. Then we found the first carcass, a deer, or what was left of one, encased in hardened sap like some prehistoric insect in amber. The tissue underneath was perfectly preserved, mummified. The lab boys were baffled. They said the composition of the sap didn't match any known species of tree. More disturbing were the marks on the bone's long parallel grooves that looked disturbingly like claw marks. I started spending my off hours in the county library, digging through historical records. That's where I found the pictographs. They were documented in an anthropologist's field notes from 1887, sketched from cave walls deep in the grove. The images showed tall, spindly figures emerging from trees, carrying people away into the canopy. The anthropologist's notes mentioned a local tribe's warnings about those who walk between bark and heartwood. The warnings were clear. Stay away from the oldest trees during the heavy rains. Dave thought I was getting obsessed. Maybe I was. But when he disappeared during a night patrol in late May, I knew I'd been right all along. The official search found nothing, just like with the Stevensons. But I kept looking. That's when I found the first cocoon. It was nearly invisible from the ground, tucked into a fork almost 200 feet up an ancient sequoia. I'd only spotted it because of a glint of morning sun on its surface. That same amber substance spun into a papery shell the size of a man. Through my binoculars, I could see dark shapes moving inside. The shape was human, but the movement, no person moves like that. The logging operation that started that June made everything worse. Pacific Lumber had won the contracts despite local protests, and their crews moved in with all the subtlety of an invasion force. The first week was quiet. Then the disappearances began. 2 men vanished from the night shift. We found their hard hats the next morning, covered in fresh sap. 3 more disappeared the following week. This time, we found one of them. He was still alive, if you could call it that, cocooned in that amber shell, high in the branches of a 1,000-year-old sequoia. Through the translucent casing, we could see him moving, twitching. When the rescue team finally got him down, he couldn't speak, just stared at the canopy and made this awful keening sound. They took him to County General, but he never said a word. Died 3 days later from what the doctors called unknown toxic exposure. I knew I had to end it. The logging had stirred up something that had been sleeping in those woods for God knows how long, and now it was hungry. I took my old service pistol and a backpack full of supplies, told the station I was running a routine patrol, and headed deep into the grove. I had a theory about where their nest might be, a hollow giant that local tribes had marked with warning signs centuries ago. I found it just before dusk. The tree was ancient, its trunk wide enough to drive a truck through. The hollow at its base looked like a gateway to hell itself, all sticky with fresh sap and smelling of decay. I switched on my flashlight and stepped inside. The beam caught movement above me, quick, jerking motions, like someone puppeteering a broken marionette. Then I saw them. They moved through the hollowed trunk like spiders, their bark-like skin making them nearly invisible against the wood, limbs too long, too jointed, fingers like brittle twigs that ended in points sharp as thorns. Their faces, God help me, their faces were almost human but wrong. Like someone had carved a person's features into wood and left them to warp and split in the rain. They descended in silence, moving with impossible grace. I fired twice, but the bullets just thudded into their bark-like hide. Then something hit me from behind, and I felt those twig fingers close around my throat. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness was being dragged upward, the sound of wood creaking all around me. I woke up 3 days later in a hospital in Eureka. The official report says a search party found me half-conscious at the base of the hollow tree, babbling about tree people. There had been a fire, half the grove was scorched. They found bodies in the burned sections. Not all of them were human. Pacific Lumber withdrew their contracts the following week, cited safety concerns and unstable ground conditions. The grove was designated a protected area that winter. No logging allowed. These days, the trails are still open, but rangers warn hikers to stay on marked paths and exit the woods before dark. Sometimes I drive up there, park at the old fire road entrance, and just listen. On quiet nights, when the fog rolls in thick, you can hear them moving in the canopy. That soft scratching sound of wood on wood, like branches swaying in a wind that isn't there. The locals say the tree walkers are still up there, watching, waiting for the next fool who ventures too deep into their domain. I know the truth. They've always been there, living between heartwood and bark, guarding secrets as old as the forest itself. We just forgot how to see them, or maybe we chose to forget. Some things, after all, are better left unseen. They never did find Dave's body, or the Stevensons, or any of the missing loggers, but sometimes, on very dark nights, I think I see lights moving between the trees behind my house. And every spring, when the heavy rains come, I find fresh amber sap on my windowsills. I don't check the trees above my roof anymore. Some questions are better left unanswered. After 15 years studying wolf populations in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, I'd never seen anything like it. Entire packs abandoning their territories in the dead of winter when food was already scarce. It went against everything we knew about wolf behavior. But the GPS collars didn't lie. Every tagged pack within 50 miles of the old Superior mining district was moving east, fast and purposeful, like something was driving them out. That should have been my first warning. My name is Helen McCarthy. In 1993, I was a wildlife biologist for the Department of Natural Resources, specializing in wolf population dynamics. Fresh off a bitter divorce and throwing myself into work, I'd taken the lead position at our most remote research station, a renovated logging camp deep in the Ottawa National Forest. The isolation suited me. Just me, my research, and the wolves. The station itself was simple. A few weathered cabins scattered around a central lodge, all built in the 1930s when the logging companies still operated here. The nearest town was 40 miles south, and the only other human presence came from the occasional DNR patrol checking the old mine entrances that dotted the forest. Those mines worried me more than the wolves ever did. The whole area was honeycombed with abandoned shafts, some going hundreds of feet deep. Every few years, someone would ignore the warning signs and fall in. They rarely found the bodies. I first noticed something was wrong in early December. The temperature had dropped to -20, coating the pines in hoarfrost that glittered like broken glass in my flashlight beam. I was reviewing data from our tagged wolves, tracking their movements through the long winter nights, when I noticed Pack 274, the Sturgeon River Pack, had completely vanished from their traditional hunting grounds. At first, I assumed equipment failure. GPS collars malfunction all the time in extreme cold. But then Pack 167 disappeared too, and Pack 892. Within 2 weeks, every wolf pack in my study area had abandoned territory they'd held for generations. That's when the howling started. I'd heard wolves my entire career. Their howls were familiar, almost comforting, a reminder that some wild things still survived in this world. But these howls were different. They came after midnight, when true wolves rarely vocalize. The pitch was wrong too deeper, with harmonics that made my skin crawl. Sometimes they seemed to form words, though I told myself that was impossible. The first tracks appeared the next morning. I found them in the fresh snow while checking our perimeter cameras, massive paw prints, bigger than any wolf I'd ever documented. But these weren't normal wolf tracks. The stride length was all wrong, and occasionally the prints shifted to what looked like bare human feet, except for the claws. I took photographs, made plaster casts, triple-checked my measurements. According to the evidence, Something 8 feet tall had walked through our camp on 2 legs. I called it in, of course. My supervisor suggested bears, though bears should have been hibernating. When I mentioned the bipedal tracks, he laughed and blamed it on the isolation. Said I was seeing things, recommended I take some leave, get my head straight. I almost listened. Almost. Then we found the first deer. It was torn apart, literally dismembered, chunks of meat and bone scattered across 50 yards of blood-stained snow. The kill pattern was unlike anything I'd seen, not the efficient throat bite of wolves or the gutting stroke of bears. This was savage, almost playful, like something had pulled the deer apart for fun. The larger pieces showed teeth marks from multiple creatures, some clearly canine, others disturbingly human. The local dogs started changing too. Pets that had been gentle for years suddenly turned aggressive, snarling at shadows and trying to break their chains at night. 3 hunting dogs vanished from a camp 5 miles south. The owners found only scattered fur and broken collars, plus those same massive tracks in the snow. I started carrying my rifle everywhere, though I told myself I was being paranoid. Wolves don't hunt humans. I'd staked my career on proving that. But deep down, I knew whatever was stalking these woods wasn't purely wolf anymore. The attacks began in January. First, they hit my research cameras, crushing expensive equipment and shredding solar panels. Then they started testing the camp's defenses, probing for weak points. I'd wake to scratching at the walls, to heavy bodies thumping against the doors. The howls grew closer each night, calling back and forth in that terrible almost speech. I got my first clear look at one through the station's security lights. It was past midnight, and the motion sensors had triggered, flooding the yard with harsh fluorescent glare. There, at the edge of the illuminated zone, stood something impossible. It had a wolf's general shape, but stretched and distorted, balanced easily on 2 legs like a man. The proportions were all wrong, too tall, too thin, with arms long enough to touch the ground. Its fur was patchy and manged, revealing gray skin beneath. But its face, God, its face. The muzzle was shorter than a wolf's, the eyes larger and forward-facing like a predator's. When it saw me watching, it grinned, showing rows of yellowed fangs in an expression that was terrifyingly intelligent. Then it howled, and others answered from the darkness. Dozens of others. I tried calling for backup, but the phones were dead. The radio picked up only static and those horrible almost words. Through the station's windows, I could see them moving in the shadows between the trees, massive shapes flowing through the darkness with liquid grace. They were hurting me, I realized, like wolves do with prey, cutting off escape routes, forcing me deeper into their territory. 2 DNR Rangers tried reaching the station after I missed 3 days of check-ins. We found their truck 2 miles out, doors torn open, seats shredded and bloody. No bodies, just tracks in the snow, showing where they'd been dragged away. The prints shifted between wolf and human, and something in between, leading toward one of the old mine entrances. I knew I should leave. Every survival instinct screamed at me to run. But I couldn't abandon my post, couldn't let these things keep killing. And deep down, the scientist in me needed to understand what they were, so I followed the tracks. The mine entrance was larger than I remembered, the warning signs torn down and scattered. Fresh claw marks scored the wooden support beams, and that musky wolf scent hung thick in the still air. I could hear things moving in the darkness below, the scrape of claws on stone, the pad of heavy feet, and underneath it all, a sound like children crying. My flashlight beam revealed a horror show. The main shaft had been turned into a den, the walls lined with stolen camping gear and torn clothing. Bones littered the floor, deer, wolf, and human all mixed together. But worse were the fresh kills hanging from hooks driven into the ceiling. I recognized the Rangers' uniforms, though there wasn't much left of the men who'd worn them. That's when I heard the growl behind me, low, hungry, and far too close. I spun, firing blind. The flash lit up a wall of gray fur and yellow eyes. My bullet caught something, drawing a yelp, but then they were everywhere, flowing out of side tunnels, dropping from the ceiling, filling the air with their terrible, almost howls. I caught glimpses as I ran. Twisted bodies, wrong-angled limbs, faces that blended wolf and human in nightmare combinations. And behind them all, something larger, its eyes gleaming with hideous intelligence. The Alpha. It had to be. The pack leader. Through the chaos of snapping jaws and slashing claws, I saw it clearly, bigger than the others, its fur almost black, walking upright with an awful grace. When our eyes met, I saw recognition there, understanding. This wasn't just a predator. It was thinking, planning, directing its pack with terrible purpose. I ran deeper into the mines, though every instinct screamed against it. The tunnels twisted and branched, the darkness absolute beyond my failing flashlight beam. They were hurting me again, I realized. Driving me exactly where they wanted. Down, always down, into the cold heart of the earth. But I knew wolves, had studied them my whole life, and these things, for all their horrible mutations, still moved like wolves, still thought like wolves, still had wolf instincts. When I reached the central chamber, I was ready. My last flare showed me what I needed: support beams, rotted with age, load-bearing columns. While they stalked me through the darkness, I'd been counting shots, measuring distances, marking structural weaknesses. Wolves are powerful, but they fear being trapped, being buried. The Alpha entered alone, as I knew it would. Dominant wolves always take the killing bite. In the flare's red glare, it was even more terrifying. 8 feet of muscle and matted fur, standing upright like a man. Its eyes held ancient malice, and when it opened its mouth, the sound was almost words, almost human, a promise of pain to come. I shot the beams instead. The first column collapsed with a crack like thunder. The Alpha howled, a command for the pack to attack. But I was already firing again, bringing down the second support, then the third. The tunnel's ceiling groaned. Wolves began pouring into the chamber, but their own weight worked against them. As the fourth beam fell, the whole mine started to collapse. The Alpha realized too late. It lunged for me as the ceiling came down, massive jaws snapping shut inches from my face. Then the world dissolved into chaos and darkness. The last thing I heard was the pack's howls turning to whimpers of fear, then screams that were almost human, before the rock swallowed everything. I woke up in the hospital 3 days later. They'd found me half a mile from the mine entrance, though I still don't remember crawling out. The official report blamed structural collapse due to winter ice damage. They never found the bodies of the rangers, or any evidence of what really lived in those tunnels. When I mentioned wolves walking like men, the doctors blamed trauma and hypothermia. But I know what I saw, know what's still out there. Because they didn't all die in that cave-in. Through the morphine haze, I heard nurses whispering about huge tracks found in the snow outside the hospital, about strange howls in the night. And in my dreams, I still see the Alpha's eyes, intelligent, hating, promising revenge. I transferred to desk duty after that. Told everyone the injuries forced me out of field work. Let them think the wolves had finally scared me away. Better that than admit the truth, that something worse than wolves had claimed those woods, something that blended wolf and human in ways that violated nature itself. These days, I track news reports from the Upper Peninsula. Every few years, something catches my eye: missing hikers, mutilated livestock, strange tracks in the snow. The stories never make the major papers, just local rumors about wolves walking like men, about howls that sound almost like words. The wolves still won't return to that part of the forest. Smart creatures, wolves. They know when they've been replaced by something worse, something hungry, something patient, something that remembers. I check my doors twice every night now. Keep silver bullets in my bedside drawer. though I tell myself that's superstition. And on winter nights, when the wind howls across the lakes, I lie awake and wonder, did they all die in that mine, or did some survive? Are they still down there in the darkness, breeding, growing stronger, teaching their pups to walk upright, to think, to hate? And sometimes, in the deepest part of night, I swear I hear howls in the distance. Not quite wolf, not quite human, getting closer. I've worked as a wildlife ranger in the Atchafalaya Basin for 15 years, but what happened during the floods of '97 still haunts me. Some nights when the cypress trees creak in the wind and the bullfrogs go suddenly silent, I find myself back there, back when we discovered something ancient and terrible stirring in those dark waters. My name is David Walker. Like my daddy and his daddy before him, I was born to protect these swamps. The locals know me as the guy who can navigate the basin's treacherous waterways blindfolded. At least, that's what they used to say. Now they don't talk about me much at all. Can't blame them, not after what happened. It started with the gators. In my line of work, finding a dead alligator isn't unusual. They're territorial creatures, known to fight each other during mating season. But this was different. The carcasses we found that spring were mutilated in ways that defied explanation. These weren't just dead gators. They were torn apart, like something had reached inside their armored bodies and pulled them to pieces. I remember the first one clearly. It was early March, and the water levels were already rising from the heavy rains up north. Tommy Beauchamp, an old Cajun fisherman I'd known since childhood, radioed in about a dead bull gator near his favorite fishing spot. When I arrived, I found Tommy in his weathered flat-bottom boat, his dark eyes fixed on something in the water. He didn't say a word, just pointed. The gator was massive, easily 14 feet long. But what struck me wasn't its size, it was the way it had been killed. The belly was split open from throat to tail, but the edges weren't clean like you'd see from a poacher's knife. They were ragged, twisted, as if something had peeled the tough hide away like orange rind. The internal organs were simply gone. "Jamais vu quelque chose comme ça," Tommy muttered, shaking his head. "Never seen anything like it." Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. Mon grand-père, he used to tell stories, said there were things in the deep parts of the swamp, ancient things, said when the waters rise too high, they rise with it. I brushed it off then, chalked it up to old Cajun superstitions. We get a lot of those out here, passed down through generations like family recipes, but Tommy wasn't done. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "They're waking up, David. Les dormeurs. The sleepers. Mon grand-père said they come in cycles, with the great floods. Last time was 27. Before that, 1874. He crossed himself. These waters, they're higher than I've ever seen them." I wrote up my report, citing a possible alligator-on-alligator attack, though deep down I knew no gator could have done that kind of damage. I figured it was a one-off thing, maybe some new invasive species we hadn't documented yet. But 2 days later, we found another one. Then, another. Always the same pattern. Bodies torn apart, organs missing, no signs of scavenging by other predators. That's when I started noticing the lights. At first, I thought they were just reflections from my boat's running lights, little ghostly streams of phosphorescence in the dark water. But they moved wrong, pulsing with a sickly green glow that seemed to come from deep below the surface. They followed my boat sometimes, keeping pace even when I gunned the motor through the twisting channels between the cypress trees. The local fishing community started getting nervous. People reported seeing something big moving under their boats, something that made even the biggest gators flee. Then Marcel Thibodeau disappeared. Marcel was an experienced fisherman who knew these waters as well as anyone. They found his boat 3 days later, half submerged, near the deep channel we call the Trou Noir, the black hole. The hull was crushed from below, like something had squeezed it in a giant fist. My brother Jake was the next to vanish. He was working the night shift at our ranger outpost, monitoring water levels during a particularly heavy storm. His last radio transmission still plays in my nightmares. "David, there's something. Christ, it's huge. The water's acting weird, moving against the current. I'm going to check it out." Static. Then, "Oh God, oh Jesus. David, it's coming up through the..." The radio went dead. By the time I reached the outpost, the water around it was churning like a washing machine. The dock was splintered, and long, deep gouges marked the wooden walls, gouges that started 8 feet above the water line and dragged down into the depths. That's when the local militia got involved. They came with their boats and their guns, led by Pete Bergeron, a former Marine who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam. Pete had a reputation for solving problems with firepower, and he was convinced we were dealing with some kind of giant alligator or anaconda that had made its way up from South America. I've worked as a wildlife ranger in the Atchafalaya Basin for 15 years, but what happened during the floods of '97 still haunts me. Some nights when the cypress trees creak in the wind and the bullfrogs go suddenly silent, I find myself back there, back when we discovered something ancient and terrible stirring in those dark waters. My name is David Walker. Like my daddy and his daddy before him, I was born to protect these swamps. The locals know me as the guy who can navigate the basin's treacherous waterways blindfolded. At least, that's what they used to say. Now they don't talk about me much at all. Can't blame them, not after what happened. It started with the gators. In my line of work, finding a dead alligator isn't unusual. They're territorial creatures, known to fight each other during mating season. But this was different. The carcasses we found that spring were mutilated in ways that defied explanation. These weren't just dead gators. They were torn apart, like something had reached inside their armored bodies and pulled them to pieces. I remember the first one clearly. It was early March, and the water levels were already rising from the heavy rains up north. Tommy Beauchamp, an old Cajun fisherman I'd known since childhood, radioed in about a dead bull gator near his favorite fishing spot. When I arrived, I found Tommy in his weathered flat-bottom boat, his dark eyes fixed on something in the water. He didn't say a word, just pointed. The gator was massive, easily 14 feet long. But what struck me wasn't its size, it was the way it had been killed. The belly was split open from throat to tail, but the edges weren't clean like you'd see from a poacher's knife. They were ragged, twisted, as if something had peeled the tough hide away like orange rind. The internal organs were simply gone. "Jamais vu quelque chose comme ça," Tommy muttered, shaking his head. "Never seen anything like it." Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. Mon grand-père, he used to tell stories, said there were things in the deep parts of the swamp, ancient things, said when the waters rise too high, they rise with it. I brushed it off then, chalked it up to old Cajun superstitions. We get a lot of those out here, passed down through generations like family recipes, but Tommy wasn't done. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "They're waking up, David. Les dormeurs. The sleepers. Mon grand-père said they come in cycles, with the great floods. Last time was 27. Before that, 1874. He crossed himself. These waters, they're higher than I've ever seen them." I wrote up my report, citing a possible alligator-on-alligator attack, though deep down I knew no gator could have done that kind of damage. I figured it was a one-off thing, maybe some new invasive species we hadn't documented yet. But 2 days later, we found another one. Then, another. Always the same pattern, bodies torn apart, organs missing, no signs of scavenging by other predators. That's when I started noticing the lights. At first, I thought they were just reflections from my boat's running lights, little ghostly streams of phosphorescence in the dark water. But they moved wrong, pulsing with a sickly green glow that seemed to come from deep below the surface. They followed my boat sometimes, keeping pace even when I gunned the motor through the twisting channels between the cypress trees. The local fishing community started getting nervous. People reported seeing something big moving under their boats, something that made even the biggest gators flee. Then Marcel Thibodeau disappeared. Marcel was an experienced fisherman who knew these waters as well as anyone. They found his boat 3 days later, half submerged, near the deep channel we call the Trou Noir, the black hole. The hull was crushed from below, like something had squeezed it in a giant fist. My brother Jake was the next to vanish. He was working the night shift at our ranger outpost, monitoring water levels during a particularly heavy storm. His last radio transmission still plays in my nightmares. "David, there's something. Christ, it's huge. The water's acting weird, moving against the current. I'm going to check it out." Static. Then, "Oh God, oh Jesus. David, it's coming up through the..." The radio went dead. By the time I reached the outpost, the water around it was churning like a washing machine. The dock was splintered, and long, deep gouges marked the wooden walls, gouges that started 8 feet above the waterline and dragged down into the depths. That's when the local militia got involved. They came with their boats and their guns, led by Pete Bergeron, a former Marine who'd served 3 tours in Vietnam. Pete had a reputation for solving problems with firepower, and he was convinced we were dealing with some kind of giant alligator or anaconda that had made its way up from South America. I've never told anyone the real reason why Section D of Mammoth Cave was sealed off in 1968. The official records claim it was due to structural instability following unexplained seismic activity. That's what we told the press, the public, and even most of the park staff. But I was there. I know what really happened in those depths. And now, after 56 years of silence, I think it's finally time someone knew the truth. My name is Margaret Reynolds Megg, to everyone who knows me. I was the first female ranger at Mammoth Cave National Park, and in 1968, I was part of the team that discovered what we called the Deep Below. What we found there changed everything I thought I knew about life on Earth. More importantly, it changed what I knew about death. The trouble started in early March. I remember because the dogwoods were just beginning to bloom, their white petals drifting across the parking lot like summer snow. We'd been getting strange readings from our seismographs for weeks. Nothing major, just odd vibrations that didn't match any known pattern of cave settlement or tectonic activity. Dr. Harrison, our lead geologist, said they looked almost rhythmic, like a giant heart beating somewhere in the stone. I was leading a routine survey of a newly discovered passage when I first noticed something was wrong. The cave system had been acting strange lately. Changes in air current, unexpected cold spots, that sort of thing. But caves are living things in their own way, always changing, so we didn't think much of it at first. That morning, though, something felt different. The air had a thickness to it, like breathing through wet cotton. "Hey, Meg, you need to see this," Tom Chen, one of our junior spelunkers, called from around a bend. His headlamp beam bounced erratically off the limestone walls as he waved me over. I found him staring at a section of wall that opened into a narrow crevice. The limestone here was different, darker, with strange striations I'd never seen before. But what caught my attention was the art. The cave paintings were unlike anything in our records. Most Native American cave art in the region depicted hunting scenes or spiritual imagery. These were different. They showed massive, twisted forms with too many limbs, hunting in packs through underground rivers. The pigments used were unusual, too. Instead of the typical ochres and charcoal blacks, these had been painted with something that seemed to gleam faintly in our lamplight. "How old do you think these are?" Tom asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I ran my fingers over the images. The surface was smooth, worn by time, but the paintings themselves seemed to have been carved into the stone before being filled with that strange, shimming pigment. "I'm not sure. But look at these marks here. I pointed to a series of deep gouges in the rock beside the paintings. These aren't tool marks. They looked more like claw marks, but that was impossible. Nothing that could make marks that deep in solid limestone could possibly. A sound echoed through the passage then, a long, low vibration that made my teeth ache. Both our headlamps flickered simultaneously. "Just settling rocks," Tom said quickly. Neither of us believed it. That was our first warning. We should have listened. Over the next few weeks, things escalated quickly. 3 different survey teams reported equipment missing, expensive gear that later turned up crushed and mangled, as if something had tried to eat it. The bats began abandoning their roosts, pouring out of the cave entrances in vast clouds that blotted out the sun. Even the crickets and cave crayfish seemed to be fleeing deeper into the system, away from areas they'd inhabited for decades. Then the first tour group vanished. It was a standard guided tour, 12 tourists, 2 guides, all experienced cavers. They went in through the main entrance of Section D for a 4-hour exploration. 8 hours later, when they hadn't returned, we sent in a search party. They found the guides' equipment scattered across Chamber 23, known as the Cathedral Room for its soaring ceiling and natural stone formations. Helmets, ropes, first aid kits, everything abandoned. But no blood, no signs of struggle, just empty cave and that same strange vibration humming through the stone. The second group disappeared 3 days later, the third a week after that. By then, we'd lost 27 people to whatever was down there. The Park Service wanted to close the cave entirely, but Dr. Harrison convinced them to let us make one final expedition. He believed he knew what we were dealing with, though looking back, I wish he'd kept his theories to himself. "Think about it," he said during our prep meeting. "The seismic patterns, the claw marks, the hunting behavior. We're dealing with something that evolved down here, isolated from the surface world for millions of years. Something that's been hibernating, waiting for food to become plentiful again." "You're saying there's some kind of prehistoric creature down there?" I asked, trying to keep the skepticism out of my voice. Harrison spread his geological surveys across the table. "Look at these cave formations. Some of these tunnels show signs of being carved not by water, but by something moving through the rock itself. And these audio recordings." He played back one of the seismograph readings through a specialized speaker. The low rumble transformed into something else, a series of clicks and chirps that sounded disturbingly like whale song. "They're using echolocation," Tom said quietly. "Like bats, but much more powerful." "Exactly. And now they're awake and hungry." Our final expedition team consisted of 5 people: myself, Tom, Dr. Harrison, and 2 senior rangers named Mike Dawson and Sarah Cooper. We were also accompanied by 3 survivors we'd managed to rescue from previous incidents, tourists who'd gotten separated from their groups and managed to find their way back to the main passages. They insisted on coming along to help search for their missing companions, despite our protests. We entered Section D at dawn, on April 15, 1968. The air was different now, heavy with a musty, organic smell that reminded me of rotting meat. Our headlamps seemed dimmer than usual, the beams struggling to penetrate the darkness ahead. The first few hours were tense but uneventful. We passed through familiar chambers, marking our path with both physical markers and radio beacons. The deeper we went, the more the cave changed. The limestone walls gave way to darker stone shot through with those strange glimmering veins. The passages became more organic-looking, less like natural cave formations and more like tunnels. We found the first nest 6 hours in. It was Sarah who spotted it, a massive chamber off the main passage, its floor covered in what looked like huge, leathery eggs. Most were broken open, their shells scattered like shattered pottery. The walls were lined with that same phosphorescent material we'd seen in the cave paintings, casting everything in a sickly green glow. "Jesus Christ," Mike whispered, his voice tight with horror. "How many do you think?" "Dozens," Harrison said, examining one of the intact eggs. "Maybe hundreds. And look at this. He pointed to deep grooves in the chamber floor. These are recent. Whatever hatched here, it hatched within the last few months. That's when we heard it, a sound like wet leather being dragged across stone, coming from one of the higher tunnels. Our lights caught movement in the darkness, something pale and segmented withdrawing into a crevice. "Nobody move," I breathed. "They hunt by sound and vibration. Like Harrison said, they're using echolocation." For a long moment we all stood frozen, hardly daring to breathe. The scratching sounds continued above us, moving from tunnel to tunnel. Whatever it wasn't alone. Then one of the tourists, I never learned his name, panicked. He turned to run and slipped on the slick cave floor. His scream echoed through the chamber like a dinner bell. What happened next still haunts my nightmares. They came from everywhere at once, pale, writhing shapes dropping from the ceiling, squeezing through cracks we'd thought too small for anything larger than a rat. In our lights, I caught glimpses of segmented bodies, too many limbs ending in hooked claws, eyeless heads with gaping, circular mouths lined with rings of teeth. The tourist who fell never had a chance. One of the creatures wrapped around him like a pale python and simply squeezed. The sound of cracking bones was lost beneath his screams. "Run!" I shouted, already pulling my rifle from its sling. "Back to the main passage." What followed was chaos. We scattered, trying to find our way back through tunnels that all looked the same in the panic. I lost track of most of the others in the darkness. Our lights were failing now, power draining at an impossible rate. The creatures seemed to be everywhere, herding us deeper into the cave system. I ended up in a narrow side passage with Tom and one of the surviving tourists, a woman named Rebecca. We could hear the others shouting in the distance, their voices mixing with other, less human sounds. "There's an underground river near here," Tom gasped, pressing against the wall as another of those hunting cries echoed through the tunnels. "If we can reach it, they'll hear us moving through the water," Rebecca protested. "They already know where we are," I said. "But the river might lead to another way out. These caves all drain somewhere." We had no choice. The sounds behind us were getting closer, that horrible wet sliding punctuated by clicks and chirps that made my skull vibrate. We found the river passage and waded in. The water was chest deep and cold enough to steal my breath, but at least it was flowing. That meant it had to lead somewhere. We'd gone maybe 100 yards when Tom's light finally died. Rebecca's followed a few seconds later. Mine was barely holding on, casting just enough light to see a few feet ahead. That's when we heard the splashing behind us. They were in the water, too. What happened next is still a blur in my memory. I remember shooting blindly behind us as pale shapes churned through the water. I remember Tom screaming as something wrapped around his leg and pulled him under. I remember Rebecca finding a side passage and pulling me into it, both of us scrambling through darkness as thick as tar. We ended up in a massive chamber we'd never mapped. My light was almost dead, but in its fading beam, I saw something that made my heart stop. The entire cavern was filled with a lake of black water, and in that water, movement. Hundreds of pale shapes, writhing just beneath the surface. The juvenile creatures Harrison had theorized about. An entire colony of them. "There's another passage," Rebecca whispered, pointing to a narrow crack in the far wall. "If we can just..." My light died. In the absolute darkness, the sounds were deafening, splashing, scratching, that terrible chittering that seemed to come from inside my own head. We pressed against the wall, trying to inch our way toward the passage Rebecca had seen. Then my hand found something in the darkness, a box of dynamite, left behind by one of the earlier survey teams. What I did next was pure instinct. I lit the fuse with my waterproof matches and threw it toward where I remembered the lake being. Then I grabbed Rebecca's hand and ran. The explosion was deafening in the confined space. The shock wave knocked us both off our feet. But more importantly, it brought down half the ceiling, sealing off the chamber, and hopefully, the creatures inside it. Somehow, we found our way back to the main passage. Emergency teams were already on their way in, drawn by the sound of the explosion. Of our original group of 8, only Rebecca and I made it out. The cave system was sealed the next day. Hundreds of tons of concrete were poured into the main entrances of Section D. The official story was released: structural instability, sealed for public safety. Most people accepted it. They wanted to accept it. But sometimes, late at night, I take out the sonar readings from that last expedition. I play them back and listen to those alien songs echoing up from the deep. And I wonder, did we really seal them all in? Or did some of them find another way out, through all those hundreds of miles of unmapped tunnels? Because the thing that terrifies me most, the thought that keeps me awake at night, is this: those creatures had obviously been down there for millions of years, hibernating, waiting. What woke them up in 1968? And what else might still be sleeping in the dark places of the world, waiting for its time to wake? I never planned to tell this story. For 36 years, I've carried it like a stone in my chest, weighing heavier with each passing season. But with the recent disappearances along Maine's northern coast, 3 fishing boats found drifting in the fog, crews vanished without a trace. I can't stay silent anymore. The pattern is too familiar. The signs are all there. They're returning. I was 42 when it happened, serving as lead ranger for the Black Point Coast Reserve. Before that, I'd spent 15 years in the Coast Guard, navigating some of the worst storms the Atlantic could throw at us. I thought I understood the sea and its moods. I was wrong, dead wrong. The summer of '88 started like any other in our little corner of Maine. Tourism picked up as June rolled in, though our stretch of coastline never drew the crowds you'd see in Bar Harbor or Old Orchard Beach. We liked it that way. Black Point was a working town: fishermen, lobstermen, and enough small businesses to keep the locals employed. The lighthouse had been automated for years, but we kept Ted Morrison on as keeper, maintaining the historic building and running tours during the season. The first sign something was wrong came during a routine patrol in early July. The fog had rolled in thick that morning, which wasn't unusual for our coast. What was unusual was how it moved. I'd been watching fog banks my entire career, and they don't behave the way this one did. It seemed to pulse, almost breathe, creating shapes that didn't match the wind patterns. I was checking the hiking trails near the lighthouse when I saw the first figure. Just a shadow at first, a darker patch in the swirling gray. But as I watched, it took form, human-shaped but wrong somehow. Like a charcoal sketch someone had smudged with their thumb. When I called out, it didn't respond. Just stood there, swaying slightly, before dissolving back into the mist. I told myself it was just a trick of light and shadow. We got plenty of strange optical effects around the lighthouse, especially in heavy fog. But deep down, I knew better. 25 years of maritime experience had taught me to trust my instincts, and every nerve in my body was screaming that something was fundamentally wrong. The next day, the Matthews brothers' boat was found floating empty 2 miles offshore. The Mary Ellen was intact, no signs of struggle or equipment failure. The coffee in the thermos was still warm. Their survival suits were stowed in their usual place. It was as if Tom and Rich had simply stepped off into thin air. I was part of the search team. We combed every inch of that coastline for 3 days straight, found nothing. But during the night shifts, every one of us saw them shapes in the fog that looked like people we knew. Several crew members swore they saw the Matthews brothers standing on the rocks, waving to come closer. Our radios picked up fragments of voices that sounded just like them, calling for help. Ted Morrison, up in the lighthouse, started reporting strange incidents. He'd see someone climbing the tower steps, but when he checked, no one was there. He'd hear conversations in empty rooms. Worst of all, he swore he saw himself one night, standing out on the gallery deck. staring in through the windows with eyes that reflected light like a cat's. The cold spots came next, patches of air so frigid they'd freeze the moisture in your lungs if you walked through them. They'd appear anywhere, even indoors, lasting anywhere from minutes to hours. Scientists from the university came to investigate. Their instruments showed temperature drops of 40 degrees or more, with no explanation for what was causing them. That's when I started digging into local history. In the town library's maritime collection, I found references to similar events dating back to colonial times. The indigenous Abenaki people had warnings about those who walk in the sea smoke. Portuguese fishermen in the 1600s marked this stretch of coast with the phrase, "Aqui moram os nevoeiros, here dwell, the fog walkers." Again and again the same pattern. Mysterious fog, people vanishing, figures that mimicked the missing. By August, 5 more boats had been found drifting. The fog never lifted. Tourism dried up. Families started leaving town. Those who stayed reported seeing loved ones in impossible places, or meeting neighbors who turned out to have been home all along. The air felt thick, heavy with more than just moisture. It hurt to breathe sometimes, like something was being pulled out of you with each exhale. I lost my first ranger team in late August. 4 experienced officers, people I'd worked with for years, all vanished during a routine patrol. Their vehicles were found parked at different points along the coast road, engines running, windows fogged up from the inside. The fog was so thick that day we had to use GPS to find them. When we opened the doors, the seats were empty but still warm. The next morning, I saw all 4 of them walking out of the fog near the lighthouse. I knew they couldn't be real. We'd found evidence in their cars that proved they were gone, but they looked absolutely perfect. Every detail was right, down to Sarah's chipped tooth and Miguel's favorite coffee thermos. They called out to me using our old jokes, private things only the real rangers would know. I ran. It was blind panic, I'll admit it. Sprinted all the way to the lighthouse, where Ted let me in and barred the door. We watched from the tower as the things wearing my friends' faces stood at the base, looking up with expressions that weren't quite right, like masks that didn't quite fit. That's when Ted told me about the logbooks. Generations of lighthouse keepers had maintained private records, separate from the official logs. They documented the patterns, the signs, the ways to survive when the fog walkers came hunting. Ted's grandfather had been keeper in the 30s, had lived through the last cycle. The entities were ancient, the log suggested, things that had existed in the space between sea and sky since before humans walked the earth. They fed on life itself, not just bodies, but memories, experiences, the very essence of what makes us who we are. They could take any form they found in the minds of their victims, perfect copies drawn from memory, but they couldn't create, only imitate. And they were bound by certain rules, patterns as old as the tides themselves. They couldn't cross running water. They couldn't enter a dwelling without invitation. And they were vulnerable to certain combinations of natural forces, the right wind, the right lunar phase, the right alignment of elements. We spent that night in the lighthouse, watching more and more figures gather below. The fog was so thick now we could barely see the ground, but every few minutes it would thin just enough to reveal dozens of familiar faces missing townspeople. My rangers, faces I'd known my whole life. They called up to us all night, using voices they'd stolen from their victims. The next morning we tried to warn the town, but it was too late. Half the buildings stood empty, personal belongings left exactly where they'd been dropped. The other half held people who might or might not have been themselves anymore. You could tell something was wrong if you looked close in expressions that never quite changed, movements that were too smooth or too jerky, voices that had the wrong echo to them. Ted and I retreated to the lighthouse with anyone we were absolutely certain was still human, 17 people in all. We barricaded ourselves in and studied those old logbooks like our lives depended on it, because they did. The entities were strongest at night, we learned, and during the new moon, They could be weakened by certain combinations of salt, iron, and fire. Most importantly, they could be driven back to their own realm through an ancient ritual that had to be performed from the lighthouse gallery. We spent 3 days preparing, watching our supplies dwindle as the fog grew thicker and the number of figures outside multiplied. The cold spots appeared inside the lighthouse now, despite our precautions. We'd catch glimpses of ourselves in mirrors or windows, only to realize we were standing nowhere near them. The radio picked up voices of people we knew were dead, telling us everything was fine, begging us to come out. The ritual had to be performed at moonrise on the quarter moon. It required 4 people at precise points around the gallery, using salvaged ship's compasses and pieces of the original lighthouse mirror to focus and redirect natural energy. The entities knew what we were planning. They threw everything they had at us, perfect duplicates of our loved ones, crying for help, visions of escape and safety, cold so intense it froze the tears on our faces. I still dream about that night. The way the fog boiled up around the lighthouse like a living thing, the sounds the sounds they made when they realized what we were doing. Not human sounds, not animal sounds either, something older, something that had never known warmth or love or mercy. The first signs came with the September frost. Peter Blackwood had spent 32 years as a ranger in this remote stretch of the Bitterroots, but he'd never seen tracks like the sea-deep gouges in the earth, as if made by rusted plow blades, dragged by unseen hands. Standing at the edge of the Wilson family's cornfield, he traced the strange symbols carved into the stalks. The morning dew hadn't yet burned off, and the mist clung to the valley like a burial shroud. Behind him, the abandoned mining town of Silver Creek sat dark and hollow-eyed against the mountainside, its weathered buildings keeping their century of secrets. "Third cow this month," Earl Wilson said, his breath visible in the autumn air. "Found her just like the other Sorgans missing, arranged all precise-like." The farmer shifted uncomfortably. "My granddaddy used to talk about the night harvesters. Said the old-timers knew better than to plant in this valley." Peter nodded slowly, his weathered face betraying nothing. His grandmother had told him similar stories, whispered warnings about spirits that walked the boundary between the living world and the dead during harvest time. He'd dismissed them as tales meant to keep children close to home during hunting season. Now, he wasn't so sure. The disappearances started the following week. 3 hunters vanished from their camp, leaving behind their rifles and gear. Search parties found only strange markings carved into trees, ancient agricultural symbols that Peter recognized from his grandmother's teachings. The same symbols had been appearing in crop circles throughout the valley. When they found Tommy Martinez, Peter's fellow ranger, he was standing in the middle of a cornfield at midnight, his eyes clouded white as milk. He spoke in a language Peter hadn't heard since childhood, old words his grandmother used in her most sacred prayers. Before they could restrain him, Tommy attacked with inhuman strength, wielding a rusted scythe with terrible precision. Peter spent sleepless nights poring over the mining town's archives. The journals told of similar incidents in 1877, when the silver boom was at its peak. The miners had desecrated an ancient tribal burial ground to expand their operations. The attacks began that harvest season, strange figures wielding farm tools, moving through the moonlight like shadows given flesh. The mining operation was abandoned by spring. The situation deteriorated as the harvest moon approached. They found the Johnson family arranged in a perfect circle in their field, their bodies posed in grotesque imitation of harvest celebration rituals. A hunting party was massacred in Miller's cornfield, their bodies torn apart by what looked like antique farming implements. Most terrifying was when the creatures began appearing in daylight. Peter caught glimpses of them through his scope, humanoid figures in tattered clothing, their movements jerky and unnatural. They carried rusted tools that seemed to shine with their own internal light. Scythes, sickles, threshing flails. Each sighting was accompanied by the smell of rotting corn and turned earth. The final confrontation came during the harvest moon. Peter had gathered every available ranger and deputy, armed them with blessed tobacco and sage from his grandmother's teachings. They found the creatures performing their ritual in the center of the largest cornfield, surrounded by dozens of possessed victims moving in a horrific dance. The battle was chaos and nightmare. The creatures moved faster than anything natural, their ancient tools tearing through Kevlar vests like paper. Peter watched in horror as his colleagues were taken, their eyes turning milk-white as the spirits possessed them one by one. The possessed joined the harvest dance, their movements becoming increasingly frenzied as midnight approached. Peter knew what had to be done. As the creatures gathered for their final ritual, he lit the field ablaze with torch made from his grandmother's sacred herbs. The fire spread impossibly fast, consuming the dry corn. The creatures screamed not in human voices, but in the sound of grinding millstones and rusted metal. Their possessed victims collapsed as the spirits were drawn back to their ancient rest. In the aftermath, 7 rangers were dead. The valley was quarantined, declared off-limits during harvest season. Peter retired the following spring, but he still serves as a consultant, teaching new rangers the old way show to recognize the signs, how to protect themselves when the harvest moon rises. They say on quiet autumn nights, you can still hear the whisper of rusted blades moving through the corn, still see strange lights dancing in the abandoned mining town. The night harvesters sleep, but their tools remain sharp, waiting for the next harvest moon to rise over the Bitterroot Mountains. The old-timers were right, some fields are better left unplanted, some secrets better left buried in the earth. Peter Blackwood learned this truth too late, paid for it in colleagues' blood. Now he keeps his own vigil during harvest season, watching the moon rise over the cursed valley, knowing that some crops are never meant to be reaped by human hands. The ground doesn't betray its secrets easily. That's something every archaeologist learns early, usually while hunched over a test pit under the merciless southwestern sun, carefully brushing away centuries of accumulated soil. But after 17 years as a ranger at Mesa Verde, I discovered that sometimes the earth doesn't just keep secrets, it buries them alive. My name is Frank Martinez. I was the senior ranger at Mesa Verde National Park during the summer of 1996, when the worst drought in recorded history hit New Mexico. The kind of drought that splits the earth into deep fissures and turns reservoir beds into cracked clay mosaics. The kind that makes people whisper about ancient curses and angry spirits. I should have listened to those whispers. It started with the pottery shards. Anyone who's worked an archaeological site knows that reconstructing broken pottery is painstaking work. Dozens of hours hunched over tables, matching edges and patterns. That's why I noticed something wrong that June morning when I entered storage room B. The fragments we'd carefully labeled and stored in separate bags were different. Several pieces that hadn't matched the day before now fit together perfectly, their edges melded as if they'd never been broken. I blamed it on memory at first. Maybe I'd forgotten cataloging these particular pieces, but when I checked the logbooks, the registration numbers didn't match. According to our records, these fragments had been found 50 yards apart. That same week, the tremors began. Small ones at first, barely enough to rattle the coffee in my mug. The USGS said it was normal for the region, just minor tectonic adjustments. But something felt wrong about them. They came at regular intervals, always at sunrise and sunset, almost like breathing. Then the petroglyphs started to change. I'd spent years studying the ancient rock art in the park. I knew every spiral, every handprint, every hunting scene carved into those canyon walls. So when Amanda Chen, one of our seasonal rangers, reported changes in panel 23, I dismissed it immediately. The idea that centuries-old carvings could spontaneously alter themselves was absurd. But I went to look anyway. I had to. The main hunting scene, one I'd photographed hundreds of times, was different. The figures were the same, but their positions had shifted slightly, like frozen dancers caught in mid-step. The central figure, which had always faced left, now looked straight out from the rock face. Its eyes, simple pecked dots in the sandstone, seemed to follow me as I moved. I spent 3 hours comparing my photos to the panel. There was no doubt. The images had changed. That's when the disappearances started. Dr. Helen Morris and her graduate student were the first. They'd been documenting newly discovered ruins in the northern section of the park. Standard procedure was to check in every 4 hours by radio. Their last transmission came at 2:15 p.m. "Frank, you need to see this. The ground. It's moving. The walls are static, then nothing." We found their equipment scattered around the dig site. Helen's notebook lay open, pages fluttering in the hot wind. The last entry read, "The pieces are returning home." No bodies were ever found. I called Samuel Whitecloud after that. He was a Pueblo elder I'd known for years, someone who understood the deep history of this land better than any academic paper ever could. His voice was grave when I described what had been happening. "They're waking up, Frank," he said. "The guardians. The drought has made the earth too thin. The old ones can hear us walking above them now." "What old ones?" "The ones who protect the sacred places. The ones who went into the earth when the ancient ones left." He paused. "They're stone and soil and memory, Frank. They remember when this was their place, and they're hungry for it again." I wanted to dismiss it as superstition, but then the ground started taking people. It happened slowly at first. A tourist straying off the marked path would stumble, the earth seeming to shift beneath their feet. We'd find them minutes later, shaken but alive, in locations they couldn't explain how they'd reached. Then the incidents got worse. The earth began opening up, not natural fissures, but perfect circular holes, like giant mouths yawning in the red soil. 3 more researchers disappeared in the next week. Each time, we'd find their belongings scattered around ominously circular depressions in the ground. The holes would be gone the next day, filled in as if they'd never existed. But the worst was yet to come. I was leading an evacuation of the park's research team when it happened. We were making our way through the Cliff Palace complex, 12 people carrying whatever equipment we could save. The sun was setting, painting the ancient walls blood red. That's when we heard it, a sound like grinding stone, like mountains shrugging off sleep. The walls of the ruin began to shift, not crumbling, moving, growing. Ancient mortar flowed like water. Stones fitted themselves together with horrible precision. The ruin was rebuilding itself, and something was emerging from the walls. I'd studied every indigenous culture in the Southwest. I knew their stories, their art, their symbols, but nothing had prepared me for what I saw peeling itself out of that ancient stone wall. It was like watching a petroglyph come to life, a figure of living rock, its surface carved with spiraling symbols that writhed and shifted as it moved. It had no face, just deep hollows where eyes should be, glowing with the dull red light of banked embers. 3 more emerged from different walls. They moved like dancers, like wind over sand, like nothing that should exist in our world. The research team scattered, running for the exits. But the earth rose up to meet them, flowing like water, swallowing them into perfect circular holes. Their screams still haunt my dreams. I ran for the kiva, the ceremonial chamber at the heart of the complex. It was foolish, trapping myself underground, but some instinct drove me there. The chamber was exactly as it had been that morning, but the air felt different, charged. The ancient ventilation shaft cast a single beam of dying sunlight onto the sipapu, the small hole in the floor that the Pueblo people believed connected their world to the spirit realm. The main guardian followed me down. I could feel it coming, each step sending tremors through the packed earth floor. I had nothing to fight it with except the contents of my pack field tools, water, and a collection of cataloged artifacts we'd been trying to save. That's when I remembered what Samuel had told me years ago about the power of sacred objects. Among the artifacts was a prayer stick we'd found that spring, still wrapped in its protective covering. I pulled it out, just as the guardian began flowing down the ladder like living sand. The reaction was immediate. The glowing pits of its eyes flared like desert lightning. It reared back, its form twisting in ways that hurt to look at. The prayer stick grew hot in my hands, hot enough to blister, but I held on. The guardian's form began to dissolve, sinking back into the earth, but not before it spoke. Not in words, but in images that burned themselves into my mind. I saw what really happened to the ancient ones who built these dwellings, saw how they didn't just leave during the Great Drought as our textbooks claimed, saw how they made a choice, a terrible bargain with forces older than humanity, saw how they became one with the earth itself, transforming into eternal guardians of their sacred places. Saw how they slept until drought and desecration called them back to protect their lands once more. The last thing I saw was a vision of the future, of more droughts, of the earth continuing to warm, of the guardians rising again and again until they reclaimed all that was once theirs. When I came to, I was lying beside the Sipapu. Sunlight was streaming through the ventilation shaft. My radio was crackling with search party chatter. 8 people had vanished without a trace that night. The prayer stick in my hands had crumbled to dust. The official report blamed structural collapse for the deaths, said the drought had undermined the ruins' foundations. The park was closed for geological assessment. When it reopened months later, large sections were permanently blocked off, declared culturally sensitive areas too sacred to visit. I retired the following spring. Couldn't bear to walk those trails anymore, knowing what slumbered beneath my feet. Knowing that with each passing year, as the earth grows warmer and the rains come less often, the ground grows thinner between our world and theirs. Sometimes, on hot summer nights when the earth is cracked and dry, I swear I can feel tremors, regular, rhythmic, like breathing, and I wonder how long before they wake again. How long before they remember this was all once theirs? The ground doesn't betray its secrets easily, but sometimes, if you listen closely enough, you can hear them stirring in their sleep, dreaming of red earth rising,